going on with Israel, you would think they would be quick to make that call. It hasn't happened. Maybe it has already, but it certainly didn't happen far enough. But where does this come from? Is this new? Is this something that's just happened recently? It isn't. In fact, you can start to see the trends here pretty early. In October of 2008, then Senator Obama told an audience in Cleveland, quote, "There is a strain within the pro-Israel community that says that unless you adopt an unwavering pro-Likud approach," which is one of the political parties in Israel, "unless you adopt an unwavering pro-Likud approach to Israel, then you are anti-Israeli," which is a silly comment to make since at that time that party had been out of power. In January of 2009, the president, upon taking office, makes a quick phone call to the Palestinian Authority president, Mahmoud Abbas, before he even phoned the Israeli prime minister. "This is my first phone call to a foreign leader, and I am making it only hours after I took office," Abbas's spokesman was quoted Obama saying. In June of 2009, the president hosted American Jewish leaders at the White House, and he reportedly told them that he sought to put, quote, "daylight," unquote, between America and Israel. Here's the quote that someone at that meeting says he made, quote, "For 8 years during the Bush administration, there was no light between the United States and Israel, and nothing got accomplished," he declared. In September of 2009, in his first address to the UN General Assembly, President Obama devoted 5 paragraphs to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which he declared, to loud applause, by the way, in the United Nations, no surprise, quote, "America does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements," end quote. And he went on to draw a connection between rocket attacks on Israeli civilians with living conditions in Gaza. There was not a single unconditional criticism of Palestinian terrorism. In March of 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton berated Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a now infamous 45-minute call, telling him that Israel had, quote, "harmed the bilateral relationship," end quote. By the way, the State Department triumphantly shared details of that call with the press. That same month, the Israeli ambassador was dressed down at the State Department. And Mr. Obama's Middle East envoy canceled his trip to Israel, and the United States, under his leadership, joined the European condemnation of Israel. In May of 2011, the State Department issues a press release declaring that the department's #2 official would be visiting Israel, Jerusalem, and the West Bank, as if Jerusalem was not part of Israel. So they leave that separate. Later in the month, only hours before Mr. Netanyahu departed from Israel to Washington, Mr. Obama delivered his infamous Arab Spring speech, which he focused on a demand that Israel return to its indefensible pre-1967 borders with land swaps. In November of 2011, an open microphone caught part of a private conversation with the president and French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Sarkozy said of the Israeli premier, "I can't stand Netanyahu. He is a liar," end quote. But rather than defend Israel, the president piled on. He said, quote, "You're tired of him? What about me? I have to deal with him every day," end quote. February of 2012, at a conference in Tunis, the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was asked about Mr. Obama pandering to, quote, "Zionist lobbies," end quote. And she acknowledged that that was a fair question, and went on to explain that during an election season, there are comments made that certainly don't reflect our foreign policy. 2014, during the Gaza conflict, the White House and the State Department criticized Israel for the deaths of Palestinians who were being used as human shields by Hamas. But far worse and far more suggestive was the president's true feelings, was his White House about his true feelings, was the decision to try and use arms supplies to Israel as a pressure point against Israel. In October of 2014, an anonymous administration official called Prime Minister Netanyahu a chicken. I can't even finish it. So that's what's happened up to this point. That's what's happened up to this point. Now, what's happened now? An election just happened 2 days ago. The first thing the White House says is, you used a lot of divisive language. And that is saying a lot from someone who's been elected at least once, probably twice, on extremely divisive language. But what about when Iran had a fraudulent election in 2009, and the people of Iran took to the streets to protest in the famous Green Revolution? You know what the White House said? We're not going to comment on that election because we're not going to interfere in the sovereignty of Iran. So they will comment on the elections of an ally, calling the rhetoric of the election divisive. But when an enemy, which is what Iran is, has a fraudulent election and kills people that protest against it, we can't comment. We can't comment because that would be infringing on their sovereignty. The other thing that's happened is the Prime Minister made a statement about how a two-state solution isn't possible given the current circumstances. And what does the White House do? They jump up and say, well, then that means we may have to reconsider. We may have to go to the United Nations Security Council now and support a resolution. That means not use our veto authority to stop a resolution that calls on Israel to create a Palestinian state with 1967 borders. Why would the Prime Minister of Israel say that, by the way? He's right. The conditions don't exist. You want to know why the conditions don't exist? Well, first of all, let's go through the history of peace negotiations. In 2000, at Camp David, Israel offered the Palestinian Authority nearly all of the West Bank, Eastern Jerusalem, and Gaza. And the Palestinians said no. In 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon. You know what that is today? A place where they launch rockets against Israel. In 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza. You know what that is today? A place that they launch rockets against Israel from. In 2008, Israel offered, again, the Palestinian Authority nearly all of the West Bank, nearly all of Judea and Samaria, and Eastern Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority said no. What about the Palestinian record? Let's begin with the fact that, according to many reports, about 6% of the Palestinian budget is diverted to pay the salary of prisoners. That means the salary of terrorists, of people who have blown up centers and killed civilians, including Americans. And they are being paid salaries and benefits, including with money from donors such as the United States, Great Britain, Norway, and Denmark. Here's another material that how the PA routinely depicts a world without Israel. This is from a Palestinian school book. Quote, Palestine's war ended with a catastrophe that is unprecedented in history when the Zionist gangs stole Palestine and established the so-called State of Israel, end quote. Or what about this particularly horrific expression of ideology which appeared in a Palestinian Authority daily as far back as 1998? Quote, the difference between Hitler and British Foreign Minister Balfour was simple. Hitler didn't have colonies to send the Jews to, so he destroyed them. Whereas Balfour turned Palestine into his colony and sent the Jews. Balfour is Hitler with colonies, while Hitler is Balfour without colonies. They both wanted to get rid of the Jews. Zionism was crucial to the defense of the West by ridding Europe of the burden of the Jews, end quote. This is from a daily of the PA. And these are the people that we're pressuring them to cut a peace deal with. What about this? The Palestinian Authority has named numerous locations and events after Palestinian terrorists responsible for killing Israeli civilians. Or what about this? This opinion piece that appears in the New York Times in 2013. Palestinian Authority television and radio stations, public schools, summer camps, children's magazines, and websites are being used to drive home 4 core messages. That the existence of a Jewish state is illegitimate because there is no Jewish people and no Jewish history. Second, that the Jews and Zionists are horrible creatures that corrupt those in their vicinity. Third, that Palestinians must continue to struggle until the inevitable replacement of Israel by an Arab-Palestine state. And fourth, that all forms of resistance are honorable and valid, even if some forms of violence are not always expedient. Instead of being schooled in the culture of peace, the next generation of Palestinians is being relentlessly fed a rhetorical diet that includes the idolization of terrorists, the demonization of Jews, and the conviction that sooner or later Israel will cease to exist. And these are the people that this president wants to put pressure on them to cut a peace deal with. I think Netanyahu is right. The conditions do not exist for a peace deal with people who teach their children that killing Jews is a glorious thing. The conditions for peace do not exist with a people, with a government, I should say, not a people. The people are victims of this government, the Palestinian Authority, and not to mention Hamas, who teach people that killing Jews is a glorious thing, that there's no such thing as a Jewish people, that any methods of destroying them is valid, that pay them salaries and benefits. This president is making a historic mistake. Allies have differences. But allies like Israel, when you have a difference with them and it is public, it emboldens their enemies to launch more rockets out of southern Lebanon and Gaza, to launch more terrorist attacks, to go to international forums and delegitimize Israel's right to exist. And this is what they're doing. This is a historic and tragic mistake. Israel is not a Republican or Democratic issue. If this was a Republican president doing these things, I would give the exact same speech. In fact, I would be even angrier. This is outrageous, it is irresponsible, it is dangerous, and it betrays the commitment this nation has made to the right of a Jewish state to exist in peace. No people on earth want peace more than the people of Israel. No people have suffered more at the hands of this violence and this terrorism than the people of Israel. And they need America's support, unconditionally. If there are differences, they need to be dealt with privately, like you do with other allies. And more than anything else, they deserve to be treated with more respect, not less, than the respect this president and this White House is giving the supreme leader of Iran. For he would not dare say the things about the supreme leader of Iran now that he's saying about the prime minister of Israel, because he wouldn't want to endanger his peace deal or his arms deal that he's working out with them. I hope he'll reconsider. I hope the bipartisan nature of our support of Israel is reinvigorated. I hope that once again this body, this Congress, and this government will recommit itself to this extraordinarily important relationship. Because if America doesn't stand with Israel, who would we stand with? If Israel, a democracy, a strong American ally on the international stage, if they are not worthy of our unconditional support, then what ally of ours around the world can feel safe in their alliance with us? With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.